The European Union is preparing punitive tariffs on iconic US brands, raising political pressure on President Donald Trump to ditch his plan for levies on steel and aluminium imports. That's according to a list drawn up by the European Commission and obtained by Bloomberg News. For more on this, European Commission Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis joins us from Brussels. Delighted to have you with us, Mr. Dombrovskis. Thank you for giving us a bit of your time. So, as I've just said, the Commission is discussing retaliatory tariffs, good morning, on US products today. What do you expect to be the results of these talks?
Well, in any case, it has been announced that EU is going to react on the situation if this initiative of President Trump on tariffs on steel and aluminium goes through. And so we are assessing what are the options of our action. In any case, we'll react in a firm and proportionate way within WTO rules. But it's also clear that EU will need to react if that kind of one-sided tariffs are going to be imposed by US.
Mr. Dombrovskis, a very good morning. It's Manus. We just heard from the Swedish Prime Minister. We heard from the German CEO, Mr. Apel, over at Deutsche Post. The Swedish Prime Minister saying, "I'm convinced that an increase in tariffs will hurt us all in the long run. And as a Swede, I am, of course, supporting the efforts of the European Union to achieve fewer trade obstacles." The risk of trade wars and the consequences of that, Mr. Dombrovskis, this is the last thing that Europe really needs at the moment.
Indeed, and that's why we hope that eventually this initiative from the US side will not be followed through, that they will not make that kind of unilateral moves which are not in line with the WTO provisions, and we will need to avoid also our actions in this regard.
Mr. Dombrovskis, a lot going on this week, along with, of course, all the concerns around trade wars. We've had the results from the Italian election. Did the results make an agreement on banking union in June less likely?
First of all, it's clear that we have to respect the outcome of the result, and now it's for Italian authorities, according to their constitution, to work towards formation of the new government. Well, as regards discussions on the banking union, EU heads of state and governments themselves set a timeline where they want to reach some conclusions already in June, and we are working also from European Commission's side within that timeline, and we think it's still realistic. Well, we must acknowledge that in a union of 28 democracies, there are always elections somewhere. We had elections in France, we had elections in Netherlands, we had elections in Germany, now we have elections in Italy, and there are going to be further elections.
And that is a very factual statement, sir. I certainly agree with you. Elections come and they go. But the rub of the matter is, Mr. Dombrovskis, that Italy could be a stumbling block towards further euro integration if we look at the accession in the populist vote of Five Star and La Liga. Do you agree with that assessment that Italy's political, I suppose, impasse can unseat the integration of Europe that you aim for?
From European Commission, we cannot prejudge the process of formation of the new government and what the stance and policies of this potential new government will be. So from European Commission side, we continue the work. We'll continue to work with member states at leaders level, at finance ministers level, and we believe it's possible to reach agreements, especially on the banking union, which has been agreed among member states that this is a priority. So we see that there are indeed practical agreements which can be reached within the next couple of months.
Mr. Dombrovskis, on sort of practical agreements with regard to integration, I want to talk about money laundering in light of what's happened with Latvia and the potential impact on the ECB. What's the best way forward if you want to centralise the enforcement of anti-money laundering rules?
Well, indeed, that's exactly what European Commission is right now looking at. So basically, we have a strong European anti-money laundering framework, but enforcement is largely national. Already, once the fifth anti-money laundering directive will enter in force, it will have more possibilities for national competent authorities to coordinate their work, to exchange information, but we must look what we can do further. This is an issue which is being raised also by ECB, and from European Commission we are currently assessing this.
Mr. Dombrovskis, Theresa May obviously negotiating Brexit and the potential new trading relationship with Europe. She says that she'll not seek passporting for financial services. First of all, were you surprised by that? The fact that she wants to include this in any free trade deal with the EU, and many accuse that of cherry picking. Is she approaching financial services from a realistic starting point?
The passporting rights for financial services providers is linked with the participation in EU single market. And since the approach of the UK government is to leave the EU single market, it means that those institutions, financial institutions in UK, will no longer have EU passports. And this point has been made.
But is there a case that it could be included in a new comprehensive trade deal? Is there the case that it could be included in a new comprehensive trade deal? Is it innovative?
Well, in any case, it's clear that we are ready to discuss cooperation in financial services, and that's also very clear from the EU side. But at the same time, EU wants to preserve its regulatory autonomy in the field of financial services. So that limits the scope of the options, so to say.
Mr. Dombrovskis, I want to ask you about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. Regulators around the world are taking different stances towards this. What sort of stance should the EU take on regulating Bitcoin? What is the starting point and where does it go from there?
Yes, actually, last week we had a roundtable exactly on cryptocurrencies and initial coin offerings to discuss what is potential EU's response to this phenomena, and some of the things which are emerging. First, we do not see it now as a systemic risk to the financial stability, not least because trading volumes in Europe are relatively small. Europe is less than 5% of total cryptocurrency trading. But we see concerns for, well, investor or consumer protection. So there we have asked European supervisory authorities to update their warnings, which they did a couple of weeks ago, clearly telling to potential investors that there is nothing actually backing those cryptocurrencies. It's basically demand and supply, and there are substantial risks, including the risk of losing your investment. And there are certain concerns as regards, for example, anti-money laundering. So there we already have proposed to include cryptocurrencies, so cryptocurrency exchanges and custodian wallet providers in the scope of our anti-money laundering framework. And now this agreement is reached already, so now we call on EU member states to transpose this directive as soon as possible so that also those provisions enter into force. But now we will also follow the international discussions in this area because it's international phenomena, and following those international discussions in G20, in other fora, we'll come back in Europe and see what further steps and reactions are needed.
Mr. Dombrovskis, is the answer to curb trading in cryptocurrencies, or do you register it as a security? It comes under the control of ESMA and then it's regulated as part of the financial system.
Currently, the trade itself is not regulated, so there are certain aspects which we are currently addressing, as I said, investor protection aspect with the warnings from supervisory authorities and this anti-money laundering aspect. Then, as regards regulations, we're currently also doing something what's called the mapping, regulatory mapping of cryptocurrencies, because also cryptocurrencies come in different kinds and not all of them fall under the same legislation.